If you're enjoying Bradbury 100, please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101, in which we explore the past, present and future of science fiction. Find it at 101sf.blogspot.com. And head over to YouTube to find my Bradbury 101 series, in which I look at Ray's books and movies. This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the life and work of American writer Ray Bradbury. I'm Phil Nichols of bradburymedia.co.uk. Welcome back to Bradbury 100, and in particular, a new batch of Chronological Bradbury episodes. Those are the ones where I discuss Ray's stories in the order they were originally published. Now, previously on the podcast, we've covered the first few years of Ray's career. We got as far as 1944, when Ray became 24 years old. We're now entering 1945, and that's a year in which Ray had no fewer than 13 stories published, including 2 different stories called Skeleton. Now, I'll be splitting these 13 across 3 episodes of the podcast so as to keep the length of the pod manageable. Let's get cracking. In today's show, we're going to cover the poems, I'm Not So Dumb, Hal's Half Hour, and The Tombstone. So we start with The Poems, and this was a short story first published in Weird Tales in January 1945, and it's available online, so I'll give you a link to that in the show notes. But the primary place that you can find the poems in Ray's books is in Bradbury Stories' 100 of his most celebrated tales. That's the second of the large compendium volumes of Ray's stories. It's also included in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 3 from 2017. Now, by January 1945, Ray's stories had appeared in several issues of Weird Tales over a period of a couple of years. But he still wasn't quite a big enough name to get onto the cover of the magazine. The Poems sits quietly in the magazine alongside stories by more established writers such as his friend Edmund Hamilton and Manly Wade Wellman. And The Poems is a curious little tale. It's about a man who discovers he has an unusual power. Rather, his wife, Lisa, discovers he has this power. David has been writing poems for years with no success, neither creatively nor financially, but one day he puts pen to paper and he believes he's finally struck poetic gold. And his wife agrees. His detailing and description of the beautiful dell just down the path from their little cottage is so vivid and inspiring that Lisa is driven to go and look at the dell. But she has some trepidation. When they get to the dell, it's dark, despite being daytime. It's as if everything there has disappeared. David thinks it's something weird in the atmosphere, so they head back home. David does some more writing, trying to capture in words something that evokes the wind they can hear. And then the wind completely stops. Lisa theorizes that whatever David successfully puts into words on paper ceases to exist in the real world. David lets it be known that his ambition is to be able to sum up the galaxy, the stars, the whole universe in a poem, and Lisa is terrified that he might do this and bring the whole world to an end. So to prevent this happening, one day she gets him drunk on champagne and dictates a simple happy ever after tale for him to write down. And we assume that's the end of it. But in an epilogue, David's publishers, presumably concerned at not hearing from him for months and months, show up near the dell looking for him, or his wife, or his house, or the dell, but there's nothing there. Well, that story is purely a fantasy, of course, and it has something in common with The Crowd or The Wind or The Scythe, in that we have a character who is somehow picked on or chosen by nature for reasons unfathomable. And the parallel with the scythe is perhaps the strongest, as the protagonists from both stories, the poems and the scythe, have mysteriously gained power over the lives of others. What works beautifully about the story is that Bradbury is able to evoke the poems without ever actually showing us the poems. He never quotes from David's writing, but he does indicate what the poems evoke. He writes, "Somehow David had caught up, netted, skeined, embedded reality, substance, atoms, mounting them upon paper with a simple imprisonment of ink. He described the green, moist verdure of the dell, the eucalyptus trees, and the birds flowing through their high, swaying branches, and the flowers cupping the propelled humming of bees. It is good, David, the very finest poem you've ever written." In doing this, Ray nicely conjures up the elation of the poet at arriving at such poetry, and the rapture of the reader of fine poetry. Although what's weak in this story is the absence of any feeling beyond the creative urge. If you think about it, the man in the scythe is somehow duty-bound to reap, yet he knows his actions bring death. Well, there's no such poignancy in the poems, just the sense of a guy who could easily stop and do something else if he just put his mind to it, but he chooses not to. It's not a bad story at all, and it's certainly more timeless than many others I've discussed in the past on these Chronological Bradbury episodes. But it somehow just lacks the sense of urgency of some of Ray's best. From the Collected Stories Critical Edition, we learn that Ray completed and sold this story in July of the previous year, so it took about 6 months to come into print. The editor of the Critical Edition, John Eller, suggests that Ray's poetic flourishes in describing David's poems are actually closer to parody, and I certainly think anyone stumbling across the story today would see it like that, or possibly see it as Ray going all self-conscious or self-referential. But given that this story was written when Ray was just 23 years old and didn't even have a trademark style just yet, my impression is of a young writer trying stuff out and succeeding. The January 1945 issue of Weird Tales includes nearly a page of Ray's own explanation of his authorship as he saw it at that time. This is in the magazine's regular column, The Eerie, which is spelled E-Y-R-I-E, in case you're wondering. It's headed, "What Can a Writer Say?" And this is what Ray says. "After writing a story like the poems, I go through and see how many times I've used some of my favourite words. All writers have certain words they especially like. With me, it's amber, or pendulum, or merry-go-round, or calliope. There's something about merry-go-rounds and brass calliopes that, to use the current slang, sends me. Perhaps it is the childhood memories from which my stories are extracted that are aroused by the shrill tooting and wheezing of calliopes, and the up and down, going nowhere in a brilliant circle of those carnival horses, that prompts me to use those words and those objects in so many of my tales." Now I find that quite fascinating. This is 1945, 2 years before Dark Carnival, which is Ray's first collection of short stories, which has a kind of a carnivalesque theme. And it's 17 years before Something Wicked This Way comes? So if you ever thought that Ray's interest in merry-go-rounds and carousels and big wheels is something that only came along in 1962, you're wrong. He was fascinated by them, even at this early stage. Perhaps because he's writing this for Weird Tales, he does take a dark turn in this little description of his authorship. He writes, "A good part of my life has been spent anticipating a merciless doom that might descend the day before some personal triumph, or happiness, or expectation was fulfilled. I believe I even feared being struck down by some wandering automobile the day I walked to get the first copy of Weird Tales with my name in it. A good deal of that apprehension has passed, though. It gets rather boring waiting so many years to be given the old heave-ho into hell or heaven, and waking up every morning very much alive, in spite of all fears to the contrary. So I imagine I shall be around a few more years." When Ray put together his first book, Dark Carnival, 2 years later, he included nearly all of his Weird Tales stories, but he left the poems out, along with a couple of others. So it seems likely that he didn't consider the poems to be among his best. And that would also explain why it wasn't included in any Bradbury collection until 2001, which was when Gauntlet Press republished Dark Carnival with an expanded table of contents. Ray, or perhaps his book editors, must have been convinced that there was some latter-day value in the story, though, because it also turns up in that greatest hits collection I mentioned earlier, Bradbury Stories. Now we're on to I'm Not So Dumb. This was first published in Detective Tales in February 1945, and you'll find it in Ray's collections A Memory of Murder, Killer Come Back to Me, The Crime Stories of Ray Bradbury, and it's also in The Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a Critical Edition, Volume 3. There's been a death at Spalding's Corner, and the sheriff is about to investigate. The narrator of the story, Peter, tells us in a very conversational style that he is always being picked on in the town because everyone thinks he's stupid, or at least intellectually challenged. But he claims at the outset, as per the title of the story, I'm not so dumb. Peter is very keen to stick his nose in, as he reckons he can solve a crime every bit as well as the sheriff and the other townsfolk. The townsfolk mock his eagerness, and for a laugh, they persuade the sheriff to allow Peter to observe the investigation. When Peter views the crime scene, he immediately makes some rather obvious deductions, followed by some not so obvious deductions. And then he suddenly draws attention to some incriminating circumstances that point towards Jamie McHugh as the perpetrator. Jamie has been the ringleader in mocking Peter up until this point. Now here's a spoiler. Mute the sound for about a minute if you don't want the story to be spoiled. Okay, here's the spoiler. The suspect, Jamie, runs away, which further incriminates him. Peter gives chase and breaks Jamie's neck, claiming it as the accidental outcome of his hot pursuit of a murderer. Except in the final paragraph, he tells us that he, Peter, was the original murderer all along. He inveigled his way into the sheriff's trust merely as a way of diverting attention from his own guilt and as a way of framing someone else. As he reminds us, he may look stupid, but he's not so dumb. I find this a neat little story. It's a humorous small-town mystery story, and it shows that in 1945 Ray was quite adept at creating odd little character sketches, and he could plot a simple whodunit. It's no masterpiece of style or anything like that, but there's nothing awkward or embarrassing about the story. The small town and the characters who live there are not a million miles away from what he'd shown us in The Jar, although The Jar has the benefit of some tremendous atmosphere, descriptions which aren't anywhere to be seen in this story because they're not needed. From the Collected Stories Critical Edition, we learn that Ray completed and sold this story in August of 1944, and that the exclamation mark at the end of the title, I'm Not So Dumb, was added by the magazine editor, not by Ray. And now, Hal's Half Hour, which Ray originally titled Mr. Priory Meets Mr. Caldwell. This appeared in New Detective magazine in March 1945, so here we are 3 stories in to 1945, 3 months in, and Ray has had 1 story published each month. Good going. You can find the story in Ray's collection A Memory of Murder, and it's also in the Collected Stories Critical Edition, Volume 3. And, I think this is one of Ray's most straightforward stories. It's a plain and simple whodunit. It's got a twist, but it's a plain and simple whodunit. He has a detective and an assistant, and the assistant is the narrator of the story. Holmes and Watson, if you like. The case being investigated is the murder of a blind man. The blind man's apartment has been turned upside down and there are scratches everywhere where the blind man has desperately tried to fight back and escape from his attacker. There is one witness to the crime, and that's the man's landlady. But she's bedridden, she didn't see anything, but she did hear the whole thing from downstairs. Some of it clearly, but a lot of it very muffled. But her account is good enough to be able to set time limits on the murder, and the detectives now know that it took 30 minutes between the arrival and the departure of the murderer. The landlady heard conversation between the two men, although she couldn't make out what they were saying, and she also heard a lot of movement in the apartment above where the blind man lived. Priory, the detective, suddenly hits on the solution to the murder, but doesn't let on what it is, and instead bets the narrator, his assistant, that he is right. And the narrator is sceptical. There doesn't seem to be anywhere near enough information to solve the crime at this point. The big mystery is why it took 30 minutes. Wouldn't a murderer be able to easily sneak up on a blind man and dispatch him instantly and then make a rapid getaway? Time for another spoiler, folks. Turn away now if you want to remain in blissful ignorance. Okay, here's the spoiler. Priory, the detective, works out from the landlady's description that in fact both the victim and the murderer must have been blind. He rapidly narrows down a small number of possible suspects. How many blind people can there be in any given small town? And then he finds all but one of the possible suspects have solid alibis, leaving just one blind man who fesses up when confronted with the evidence. Once again, this isn't a classic Bradbury tale, but it's smart and it's well plotted. And if the story sounds very unlikely, well, it is, but it's far more plausible as Bradbury writes it than I can possibly summarise. In trying to summarise it for you there, I had to really simplify it, and it's much more sophisticated in the way that it doles out information. Basically, any objection running through your mind right now as to how the mechanics of this story must work is actually addressed in the story, and quite early on. Ray proves himself here to be remarkably good at this sort of thing, which from today's standpoint is really quite funny because we usually think of Bradbury as being a master stylist, not a master plotter. According to the Collected Stories Critical Edition, Ray's agent at the time, Julie Schwartz, was very pleased with this particular story and told Ray that he should be writing more of this sort of thing instead of the weirder fiction that he, Julie, was struggling to sell. Julie knew the market and he knew what each publication wanted, and he felt that more stories like this one would go down well. But this would eventually become a problem for Ray because he didn't believe that he wrote well when he was trying to write to order. It's no good telling him, write more stories like this for this market. He just couldn't do it, or he felt that he couldn't. He came to believe instead that he should write whatever came to mind and then later on try to find an outlet for it. And the last story for today is The Tombstone, which appeared in Weird Tales in March 1945. So this is Ray's second story in that month. This one's available online, so again in the show notes I'll give you a direct link to the issue of Weird Tales so you can go and have a look for yourself. You can also find this story in Dark Carnival. In the UK only, it was also included in a collection called The Small Assassin, and it's in Ray's collection The Toynbee Convector from 1988. Ray also adapted The Tombstone for Ray Bradbury Theatre in 1992, and in fact it was the very last episode of the series, starring Shelley Duvall. And you can also find it in Collected Stories, a Critical Edition, Volume 3. Now, The Tombstone is something of a spooky comedy. A married couple arrive at a boarding house after a long journey. The wife, Leota, is surprised to see a tombstone in the room that they've rented, and she makes a fuss about not wanting to share a room with a grave, as you would. Why would you want a tombstone in your room? Well, the landlord explains, there's no grave, it's simply that the former tenant carved gravestones for a living, and he left this one behind when he left in a hurry, but he will be back to collect it. He explains further that no one ever died in this room or anywhere near it. It's simply that the carver made a spelling mistake on this particular stone, and so he was unable to make any use of it, so he left it here. He had carved the name White, W-H-I-T-E, but unfortunately the person it was intended for spelled their name with a Y, W-H-Y-T-E. Now the husband, world-weary and tired of his wife's hyperactive objections to every little thing, determines to take the room and to get some sleep. But the wife keeps hearing noises, which she swears are the sounds of the ghost of the dead person, and she almost convinces her husband to listen. But they are interrupted by the unexpected arrival of the stone carver. He wants to take his stone away now, and in fact, he seems to be remarkably happy. He's overjoyed that someone with the surname carved on the stone, White with an I, has recently died, and they want this stone. Okay, so the tombstone is now gone, but Leota hears yet more voices downstairs, and again swears it must be a ghost. The husband insists it cannot be, nobody has died. But then they hear the conversation going on down below. It's the stone carver. He's talking to a woman on the next floor down. She is Mrs. White with an I, and she has bought the stone for her recently deceased husband. Now I have to confess that I have never ever cared for this story. The central premise is okay, and it's quite intriguing, but the shifting of the tombstone to a lower floor in the building just seems very unlikely to me. The stone carver says he's having the stone transported elsewhere, and he has some people come in with a sort of a trolley thing and wheel it away. But if he's only taking it downstairs, you'd think he might have mentioned it. And even if someone has died down below, it doesn't prove that there is a ghost of any kind. What the husband and wife have heard is the voices of two living people. So I have some logic problems with the story. I accept it's a comedy. It gets a bit of free rein because of that. But I think the best comedy is built on solid logic, and this one doesn't have solid logic. On top of that, the success of the unlikely story hinges really on having some character that we can relate to. But unlike the protagonists of the poems, or the crowd, or the scythe, there's little to be sympathetic to here. The woman is something of a shrike, and I choose that word carefully. Take a look at Ray's later story, Touched with Fire, which also has a shrike-ish woman, who he actually names Mrs. Shrike. And the husband, well, he's somewhat sympathetic, but he's probably driven by laziness as much as anything else. The situation isn't quite tight enough for me, and the characters, they're not quite sharp enough. Everyone's a bit of a caricature. But that's not stopped the story finding a home on multiple occasions, so what do I know? The one saving grace of the story is the bickering between the husband and wife. That's something which Ray was good at capturing in his fiction, and it pops up every now and again in his short stories. So there you go. 4 stories, 2 of them weird tales and 2 of them detective stories, but with a Bradbury twist. And we're only 3 months into the year. In the remainder of 1945, we'll see 2 stories with the title Skeleton. You might say they're 2 versions of the same story, but they're actually quite different. And we'll find some more dark fiction and some more strange detective stories. So watch out for those further Chronological Bradbury episodes coming soon on Bradbury 100. Thanks for listening. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols. Music is provided by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. Please subscribe using your podcast app. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all good podcast places. And please also check out my YouTube series, Bradbury 101, and my other audio podcast, Science Fiction 101. For information on all of these, head to bradburymedia.co.uk.